spend the $1.50 or whatever these are nowadays. You can put a balloon over it. Okay, as long as you keep the carbon dioxide in and the oxygen out, you're good. You need raisins, unless you want to go with a fancy fermentation aid. You need honey, and you need yeast. Okay, now this yeast is a standard bread yeast. It's not what I recommend, but it will certainly do the trick. The difference between this yeast and the fancier yeasts, like these, is the amount of time it takes for it to settle out to give you a nice clear mead. They both will ferment just fine. So all of this stuff is very, very simple to get and very, very simple to work with. So really there is no reason if you're a beekeeper that you shouldn't be working with making your own mead. Okay, and I did bring some samples so that we can try that towards the end. Okay, mead has been around since over 15,000 years ago. It was one of the first fermented beverages to be noticed. It actually is, because it's so simple, all you have to do is add honey to water. There's wild yeast in the air. You're going to get a type of mead with it. One of the characteristics that you need to understand about mead is that honey, because of its nature, is very, very hard to get fermented. So there's some things that you may want to do up front to kind of kick it off, and that's what the raisins really are for. Okay, for the people that made mead, how many people use something like raisins, or how many people use like the commercial product, which I have? Okay, which one did you use? Commercial as well? Raisins?
Both actually experiment.
Okay. For getting started, I recommend you just keep it as simple as possible. Do a gallon. I typically am doing 5-gallon batches now, but I'd start off with a gallon until you can get the process down. Keep it with raisins, very simple. Buy yourself a fermentation lock or a balloon, and you're going to find that it's very, very straightforward to make. The raisins, what you do is you grind them up, basically just a handful. Add it to your water, and add your honey. Depending on how sweet you want your mead, typically you're going to do 3 pounds to 3.5 pounds of honey per gallon. Okay, so it's very, very straightforward. Add your yeast, okay, and basically set it in a cool, dark corner and just let it go. Okay, and that's as simple as it is. I'd like to tell you it's a big, complicated process, and that you got to do all this stuff. But really, it's so much simpler than almost anything else that you can make. So this is.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Robert, is it?
Bob.
Bob. My understanding is that there are yeast spores in raw honey. Is that sufficient, or?
There are, and the problem with the wild yeast is that you're never really sure what you're going to get. Okay, you can get, just like with a lot of beers, some of your European beers are sour. That's their nature, and that it's all in the yeast. So there's a whole thing about how the yeast basically work. Whether it's
the yeast controls the outcome.
To the great extent. Okay, so what you want to do is you want to really control that. So if you use a commercial yeast, like my typical go-to is this one. It's a Lavalin yeast. It's K1V 1116. And so I'm going to talk just a minute about the yeast. This yeast is very, very robust to all sorts of temperature opportunities that you may have depending on where you're fermenting. It's good in the winter, it's good in the summer. Particularly it's more tolerant to some of the warmer temperatures as opposed to some of the other ones. The other reason I like this particular yeast is it really carries a lot of the flavors through. So some of the yeast really kind of strip a lot of the flavors in the primary, which is really the first ferment that you go through. And this one doesn't. It's a really good yeast for that. During the winter, which is when I do a lot of my mead making, the more volume mead making, I use this one. It's called D47. Okay, this one particularly is very, very good for the types of meads that I like to make, which are called melomels. Melomels are fruit-flavored meads. And this one I found does really the best job of keeping a lot of the fruit flavors where we want them. Okay, the last one I'm going to talk about for very briefly is this one. It's called EC 1118, and this is called the Beast. This one, these two will typically ferment to around 11 or 12%, depending on how much sugar you feed them, or how much honey you feed them. Okay, 1118, if you treat it right, will ferment up to 20%.
There's mine.
So 1118 is what you say?
Yeah, EC 1118. Yeah, this stuff is the Beast. It eats through everything. Huh?
Did you do that about 5 times?
What? 1118? Yeah. And it's really interesting that a lot of it depends on how you like your mead again. What you're going to do is you're going to balance the amount of honey you put in with really the yeast that you use. Also, bread yeast typically will bring you to about 10 to 12%. So most of these are in that range. This one is a little different. Okay, so my notes, quick. Okay, most of the meads that I make, again, are melomels. So what I do is I find a flavor that I want to try, and then I go out and I try and buy juice or I buy pulp. I have made meads with, for example, strawberries. And I didn't bring it tonight, but strawberry, the best way to do that is you freeze the strawberries so that when they thaw out, they're all mush. Basically, you put it in your bucket with your whatever the water is to the volume that you need. Add your honey, stir it in well, and then leave it in the bucket. Because with a lot of pulp, if you're making a mead with a lot of pulp, you want all of this airspace. Okay, if I tried to put it in this jug, okay, for what we call primary, which is the first ferment, the most active ferment, it's going to plug up and it's going to blow. And ask me how I know this. Ask my wife how she knows this. You know, you open the door and immediately you know there's something different. You can smell the fruit, right? You go, oh, I hope that's not what I think it is. Then you walk in and there's this big, like a blade of, on the ceiling, where it's all blown up on the ceiling. So don't do this if you have that type of a fruit. Leave it in the bucket. Okay. Now the primary ferment, typically, no matter what you're doing, will last about 2 weeks. Okay. Most of the time, for most of the flavors that I'm doing, I will use a juice that is pretty much a clear juice. There's not much pulp to it. Okay. You're going to see a couple of them in the back. There's one which is a lemon mead, which is basically just a plain mead with. I went to Stop and Shop and you buy the frozen can of lemonade, and that's what you use to flavor it. It's that simple. Okay, and that you wait until you've done your primary ferment. It'll slow down, and then what you do is you add your flavor to it. You add more honey to bring it up to whatever the sweetness is. And then you bottle it in something with still an airlock in it, and you let it sit on the shelf for up to a year, depending on what it is. Now, as far as the up to a year, depending on the mead that you're making, the alcohol content of the mead. If you're working with 1118, okay, it will probably take at least a year for that to be drinkable. And the reason is that the yeast, when it really gets pushed to the limit, it will create things called fusels. And what they are is it's a type of alcohol, but it's not really great tasting. So most of the time when you're aging, what you're doing is you're letting the fusels leave the mead, evaporate off of the mead, and it becomes much better much tastier to drink. With these types of yeasts, which are again in the 10 to 12% range, you're going to find that you don't have to do that as much. Usually it's drinkable around 3 to 6 months. It does get better with age. Again, people that make beer and you make wine, you kind of got a clock running on that when you make it. Okay, you got 5 gallons, 21 liters. That a year from now isn't probably going to be as good. Maybe the exception of wine. 5 years from now, it's not going to be that good. 10 years from now, it's not going to be really that good, and so on. Mead is different. If you set up the mead properly and you store it properly, it only gets better with age. I started making mead, it was before the year 2000, so probably somewhere around 20 years ago. And I have some meads in my underneath my porch where I do most of my meadery work that is that old, and it just gets better as you go. The key for keeping it long term is to keep oxygen off of it. Okay, so yeast is kind of a funny beast. The yeast at the very beginning, when you dump the powder in, for the first 24 hours, the yeast actually sets up its shell and grows. It grows by budding. Okay, so what it'll do is it'll create little buds off of it, and those end up being other yeast. They'll break off, and that's how it populates. That's how it goes from a small pack to a lot of yeast. Okay, and that happens really in the first 24 hours. And during that time, it needs oxygen. Okay, so that's why if you do your ferment, your primary ferment in a bucket or something like that, it really doesn't matter as long as you keep anything from falling out in it into your mead. Once it gets past that point, you can tell that it'll change over. At the first part, it does not consume the sugars. It waits until it's actually matured a little bit, which is more 24 to 48 hours. And then what it'll do is it'll start to get hungry. Okay, and once that happens, then it'll start working on the sugars. And so at that point, you want to watch it because it's going to generate a lot of carbon dioxide. That's the way the yeast basically works on the sugar. It breaks the sugar into alcohol, and the other part of it is the carbon dioxide, which it off gases. Okay. Now, the other thing that I found, and I've fermented beer, I've fermented wine, I've done kind of all that stuff. One thing that I found that's really different with meads is the yeast stays viable almost forever. If you put it in a bottle and you do it really before the first year, if you bottle it too soon, you're going to find that it'll probably be like a bomb. It's not going to be good. It'll pressurize and it'll blow. So there's a couple of things you can do to try and prevent that. One of the things is these things called Camden Tablets, and all this stuff will be up here. You guys can come up and take a look if you want. Camden Tablets. What this is potassium metabisulfite. Okay, and it keeps the mead. It kills the yeast in the mead, and it helps stabilize the mead. Okay, but even with this, I've had some meads that I've doused with this, typically 1 tab per gallon, and then after like 6 months you put another tab in per gallon and so on. But I've had meads that I've done that with that still are bubbling after like a year, 2 years, 3 years out. So just be aware when you're doing that. Okay.
Better to drink it.
Yeah. Some of them don't stay around that long. Some of them stay around a little bit longer. Okay. After your mead has been aging for a period of time, what it'll do is it'll get clear. And for that, I'm going to ask Paula, can you go back and get me the show mead and let's say the apple pie sizer. And I'll show you what the difference is. The reason I brought these two meads is my show mead is a term that they use to describe mead that only has, it's like in Germany making beer, right? You can only have certain ingredients in it, and that's it. And that's what you take to a show. Typically, it is obviously honey, water, and yeast. And that's it. No additives or nothing else. Okay? So I'm going to basically just hold this up for you to see. Okay. This I made in the fall. Okay? And so it started to clear. Okay, it started to clear, but it's really, you can see it's still pretty cloudy. Okay, and by the way I make this is when I wash my cappings. I wash my cappings. I use a minimum amount of water. I'm very careful on how I do that. When I wash my equipment, and when I wash my extractor and everything else, I use a minimum amount of water. And then I'm just going to show these. These are the typical filters that you use. These are the smallest, finest I can get. These are 200 micron, I think. Okay, they're much smaller. If I tried to do honey through this, unless I heated it up well beyond what I want to, you'd never get anything through it. But if you do your mead through it, what it'll do is it'll take out most of your wax, your little bitty chips of wax and stuff, and then basically you just ferment it, just like everything else. You add yeast to it, and you let it go. Okay, so anyway, that's what that looks like when it's about maybe about 6 months, 3 to 6 months in. Okay.
Robert, is that a typical screw cap on the top of that?
It is, and I have to be careful with that. In fact, the reason I ran out a few minutes ago is I heard a pop in the back, and I have to tell you, when you work with meads, sometimes you get surprised, right? So, but it turned out to be just somebody taking a quick taste, so it's okay. Now this one,
I sat here the whole time.
I don't know. I thought you were out there for a minute. Okay, this one's a little harder to see, but you can see it when I put it back on the table. This is what I call my Liberty apple pie sizer. A sizer is like your hard cider, except what I've done is I've also added honey to basically boost it. Okay, so this spiced with apple pie spices, and it's a really tasty one. But you can see it's perfectly clear. It's like water. Okay, this is what it looks like when it's done.
So that's a supercharged 1118?
No, no. The thing about using 1118 is it strips everything. I mean, it really, you can use it for a show mead, but if you try and like this one, if I tried to add another flavor to it with the yeast still active, all that'll come out. It'll be just plain. It'll take all that flavor completely away. That's why I used one of the other yeasts. The K1V 1116 has always been a good yeast for me, to leave most of the flavor. So, good question. Okay, so then what you need is a siphon. Okay, now I like these. You can buy these things called thieves, where you can go in and you can take out a little bit and you can try it. And that's one thing you're going to find when you make mead is you're always tasting it, because you want to adjust the flavor and this and that. Sometimes you taste it a little more than others, but it's always good. It's always good. My wife says, "Are you still down there?" And I said, "Yeah, it's pretty good. It's getting there." So, she hasn't come back yet. I don't know. Who knows what she's doing? So anyway, I like this one because it's fairly small in diameter. It's just an aquarium air hose.
I think you need some help as a taste tester.
Yeah. So the nice thing about this is it's a small amount. So if I want to taste a mead, what I do is I always remember which hand I've got that I'm going to put in my mouth. I put it in the mead, I draw a little bit up into it, and then I can basically pull it all through, take it out, pull it all through, and I can taste. Okay, and you'll be amazed how the mead will change as time goes on. Now, particularly if you leave it long enough for it to complete. Okay. So that's pretty much it. Obviously, you want everything food grade. Anything that touches the mead should be either glass or food grade plastic. I found these are amazingly useful. These are 2.5 gallon. I got these from a bakery, and they got grains or something in them. So I've got stacks of these down where all my bee stuff is, because this is how I store honey too.
Yeah, sometimes they have different fruits when they bake in the muffins.
Yeah, you get this for free if you go and ask. I mean, they throw this stuff away. Yes?
Market Basket also sells food grade, big 5-gallon tubs.
Yeah, now the 5 gallon,
$3.
the thing I love these for is because 2.5 gallons, I don't know, I'm not what I used to be, right? I hate to admit that. My wife's still gone, right? So anyway, so 2.5 gallons for me is a really nice size. I can always stack them. So when I'm making syrup, for example, and I want to carry syrup in case I want to reload any of my feeders or anything, this is what I use. I store honey in it. I store just about anything you can imagine in these. That really is a nice size. The 5 gallon, yeah, you can if it's full, it's what, 60 pounds, 50, 60 pounds. It's like picking up a deep, right?
Yep.
So this is a little bit more my speed. But again, the point is you can get them for free. Yes.
Is there any indication when your mead is complete? Color, taste?
It's all up to you. You're going to see when we get back to the tasting part of it. I brought a bunch of different meads for you to try.
What's the minimum?
The minimum,
A year for the mead to be complete?
no, I've had some meads that are very drinkable at 3 months. But I wouldn't use the 1118. Stay with the other ones. You know, the K1V or if it's cool, the weather is cool, like in February or January, if you're looking for something to do and you want to make some meads, E47 is an excellent choice. It doesn't tolerate the heat very well more towards the summer. So you know, as the weather gets warmer, you really don't want to use that yeast because you'll get some off flavors potentially. But K1V is good pretty much for the entire range that you'd be working with. So to really answer your question, what you do is you use this, and you go in and you say, is that pretty much what I like? And when it's drinkable, it's drinkable. Now, if you're looking for something that really looks good, it will probably take 6 months, sometimes longer, depending on what you're working with, for it to really get clear. But this is very drinkable. It's sweet, but it still has some fermentation to do, but it's very drinkable. So it really is up to your taste. Yes, sir.
Now that's aquarium tubing?
Yeah, any food grade tubing.
I lost my siphon, and last week when I went down to my cellar to pull some bottles I'd like to decant, you can't find that tubing in drugstores anymore.
Really?
No, I've been to 3 or 4 drugstores, they don't
Oh,
sell
no
it.
kidding. Well, I'm going to hang on to this one then. The other thing I like about this is they call it racking. When your mead is done with its primary, what you're going to end up with is a bunch of gunk at the bottom,
A little bit.
and you get a bunch of stuff, particularly if you do cappings and stuff like I do, you get a bunch of like little chips and stuff floating at the top, right? So what you want to do is you want to take that middle. So the siphon is perfect for that because you can basically put it up on a table, put your empty bottle down there, stick it halfway down, and you can really manage that, you know, so you don't get any of the gunk at the bottom, you don't get all the crap at the top. You know, it's perfect.
I'm a little concerned that the bottles I have been in my cellar for so long, and the pitch isn't quite right. The corks may have dried out, and if the corks have dried out, will they let in the air?
Yeah,
Yeah.
they will. And the other thing is, like this bottle, if I'm going to try and store this, I'm going to basically move it into other bottles that will top up.
That's what I did.
Okay, you want it up where there's not going to be a lot. If you're stuck, what I've done is I will take marbles and I'll boil the marbles to make them sterile, and then basically plop in marbles just to bring it up so that there's very, very little air in contact with it, and that really does a great job. Okay, questions? I'm open for
Don't
questions.
rattle it too much, because then you're gonna break it.
I'm not going to break it.
Marbles.
Where do you
Oh,
buy
the marbles. Where do I buy my yeast? Online.
Yeah.
Now the thing that I typically do is I buy it in the winter, and I store it in the freezer. And just like your bread yeast, you can store it in the freezer, and whatever the date is on it, basically becomes doesn't matter. Yeast is very, very sensitive to heat, and it's not sensitive to cold. Basically, just keeps it dormant. Okay, which is also worth noting that when you sterilize or when you're preparing your equipment, really, really hot tap water does a really good job. Okay, sterilize all your bottles. Again, you want to keep the wild yeast and stuff out of there. Sterilize your equipment, but just run it under hot water, make sure everything's wet, and you're good. If you want to go further, there are some chemicals that you can use. I use Star Sand, which is a phosphoric acid-based cleaner, and it's safe. It's what they use in a lot of restaurants. You know, so if there's any residue or anything, they say you don't even have to rinse it, but it makes sure that everything's really clean. There's a question?
No, there's a brewery supply in Weymouth.
It
That's
closed.
all these supplies.
It closed.
Oh, did it?
I went there 2 weeks ago.
No kidding.
Yeah, because I was looking to buy a plastic carboy. The plastic carboys are awesome.
Right.
If you've ever worked with the glass ones, the big 5-gallon glass ones, once you try plastic, you'll never go back. And they were closed. I actually walked in. They had another shop that had moved in there, so I just walked in the door because I've been there a lot.
Yeah, me too.
And the guys were all like there. They turned around and they said, "What do you want?" You know, because I guess it's not even like a regular store anymore. It was like a warehouse or something. But I asked them about it, the guys there, and they said they moved, they left, went out of business.
So they did move to a new location in Weymouth, so from
No.
the new, like...
Not that I know
They did
of.
it on the Facebook page, that's what
Yeah.
They did? Oh, okay,
I
right.
went there-
Because it's a
I went
great
there about
place.
2 months ago, And I'm like, so has it, but they had just moved like maybe 6 months ago. so-
I'll have to look it up. I went probably about 2 or 3 weeks ago,
Okay.
and I just went to the old place. I didn't look them up on the Facebook page, so I'll have to look at that. Yes, sir.
Independent Fermentation in Plymouth has all the brewing supplies you need. They have the carboys, they have a refrigerator full of yeast, they have 7 different varieties. There's a Camelot Drive behind BJ's. They're right down there on the right-hand side. They're usually open Thursdays through Sundays.
Okay, excellent. Yes.
Should you store your bottles on their sides like you would with a bottle of wine? You're corking them?
If you have a cork, yes. If you don't have what I do a lot of times I basically have bulk store. So I've got, I have it in my, I purposely did not bring my PowerPoint this time, for those of you who remember last time, right? I have a picture of that, of what underneath my front porch looks like, and it's all these 5-gallon carboys basically everywhere. I probably have like 85 gallons of wine right now. I've stopped making beer because I don't have enough space left.
Guess I'm pulling my hair over.
I probably have
We can take
maybe
care of that for you.
maybe 60 gallons of different meads and stuff. So it just kind of fills every nook and cranny.
Processing that stuff going bad.
No, well, it's in a perfect place, because it's dark, it's temperature stabilized because it's below grade. It's kind of like a root cellar, right? And
That's why it's at my house.
yeah. If it was at your house, it wouldn't be there long, I don't think. So yes, ma'am.
How do you know when to bottle it? Or like how long can you leave it in the carboy with the airlock on it? Can you leave it in that for a year? Or when,
Yes.
when should you?
I've got some that I still have airlock that has been maybe there for 10 years.
Yeah.
Most of the stuff that is much older, going on 15, 20 years, I feel comfortable enough to put one of those plastic bungs in, okay, and then that's good. And I found that none of those have blown out so far. But anything younger than that, unfortunately, I leave in airlocks. Now airlocks, I don't know what everybody uses, but I use just cheap vodka. I find that's the best. And the reason for that is depending on what's going on temperature-wise, sometimes whatever you've got in there gets sucked back into the mead, right? So if you fill it up too much and you get a temperature, it gets warm on the outside and it's cool on the mead, that pressure will basically cause it to backfill. So I used to use water. I used to use sodium or potassium metabisulfite in water, to try and keep the yeast out. And it's just so much easier just to use just the cheapest vodka you can find, and then fill it up halfway, and you're good.
Vodka's the way to go.
Vodka is the way to go, unless you got mead.
Vodka.
Just a little bit of
Every gasoline is better. It doesn't taste like turpentine.
Yeah. Okay. Other questions?
What temperature,
Never use any.
Temperature, I try and keep it in the 50s. Typically mid-50s I find is the best for long term. But if it gets warmer, it's not too much trouble unless it gets really warm. So you don't want it in the direct sun. You don't want it outdoors on a 90-degree day type of thing. You want it in a place where it's going to stay dark, cool, and pretty stable.
Different than making shine.
Different, I guess. Never made shine that I would admit to, anyway. Yes, ma'am.
This is silly, but why do you use raisins?
Because honey
That's the way
is,
you learned it from prison.
that pruno is really good stuff when you really need it, right? Pruno. Pruno is what they make in prison. You get basically any fruit juice and you ferment and typically use a balloon or something else. I'm not going to mention. And away you go, right? And I have no experience there. My wife, I'm safe, So anyway, so it's good. So it's, I forget the question. What's the question? Sorry, I walked down that path. I must be getting old. I go, oh my God. There was a question in there somewhere.
Why do you use raisins?
Oh, raisins. Yes, thank you. Sorry about that. Honey is unique, right? Like most of you, I sell honey. I make various products with it. We make hand lotion, we make soaps, and so on like that. And I've gotten so many people that have come to us looking for honey for medical reasons, whether it be allergies or whether it be wounds. My wife had somebody that came to us. She had a wound that wasn't healing. She'd had a serious operation, and the doctor actually said, "Go find a local beekeeper and put honey on it. It has to be just some of our honey, not the Chinese crap you get in the store." So and within it was like a week or something, it healed, and it hadn't healed before. So honey has amazing restorative properties. Now, unfortunately, when you're trying to make mead, that's not in your favor, right? Because what you want to do is you want to have it broken down. You want to have the yeast be able to get at it, right? So some of the properties that make honey like that is that some of the byproducts when it starts to break down are it's hydrogen peroxide, very mild, and that sterilizes. And so the other thing is the honey just out of the hive is pretty sterile medium. You'd think that the yeast would be able to get a hold of that and go crazy, but particularly in the first part of when the yeast is building itself, it needs nutrients that just aren't there. Okay, it's kind of a wasteland, and they're really not going to thrive. So by adding either the commercial products or the handful of raisins all ground up, what you're doing is you're providing that nutrient-rich environment so the yeast can really kind of go through its first stage of reproductive process. So it goes from like one yeast to like a lot, and can really get a hold. And then once it gets to the point where the yeast is kind of matured and it has enough of a population, then it'll turn to the sugar and it'll start breaking down the sugar into alcohol. So that's the reason you add it. That's also the reason you typically have to add, if you want a really good ferment, you have to add some other type of additive if you're not using raisins.
Thanks.
Okay, you're welcome. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a difference between the golden raisins as opposed to the darker raisins? I don't know.
Different.
Not for what the question is there a difference between using golden raisins or darker raisins? And not from my experience. I mean, really what you're trying to do is you're just trying to add the nutrients for that. It's not for flavor, it's not for any of that other. It really is for that. So any of those raisins would be fine.
The
Okay?
raisins would probably just be like an added sugar that the yeast could feed on.
Yeah, and it's a little less of the sugar and more of the nutrients. But yeah, it would add a bit of sugar. And they'll all settle down to the bottom and be part of that old muck that you really want to stay away from when you're racking.
Sugar's probably not as complex, but the yeast can utilize it faster.
Well, and it's not that kind of thing. It's more of nutrients. It's more that if you look at honey pretty much is I forget if it's glucose. I think it's glucose. It's a complex sugar, and then what it does is it breaks down into fructose and sucrose. It's a sucrose. I don't know. Either way, it breaks down. Okay, but either way, it's almost pure sugar. Okay, a little bit of nutrients in there, but minerals in there. But other than that, it's pretty much pure sugar. So really, what you're trying to get with the raisins and the other stuff is more of a smorgasbord, right? Some other minerals and other substances that the yeast can use really to get a hold. It really doesn't need more sugar. It really is looking. The yeast is really looking for more nutrition. Yes, sir.
I got two questions. When you're using the 2.5 gallon bucket to start off with, what do you put on the top?
I have a lid.
Okay.
Okay, and it's mainly to keep stuff out.
Okay.
When you go through your primary ferment, the fermentation cycle is when you add your yeast, it'll be quiet for a bit unless you use a starter, and then typically in day 2, it'll really start to boil and convert over. That usually lasts about 2 weeks, 2 to 2.5 weeks, and then you'll see it'll quiet down. And once it quiets down and everything kind of starts to settle out or rise to the surface, then you can suck it off and put it into your secondary. During that whole first part, really, you've got the carbon dioxide that's being generated that really protects it. Okay, so that's really your protection. So really, even though I put a lid on it and a bubbler on it, as long as you've got something that keeps that carbon dioxide barrier intact, you're going to be good. So if you don't have a lid that you want to put a hole in and put a bubbler or something in, If you put a cloth over it, keep things out, or a piece of plastic or something like that, it's going to be adequate. Now it changes when you go into your secondary. After that 2-week period, it'll quiet down, and it'll bubble a little bit, but it's nothing like the beginning. Okay, that's when you're really aging it, and at that point, oxygen matters a lot. So that's when you can't leave any kind of air pocket on it or anything. When you fill your bottles, you always want it up into the neck or really close. If it's something like this, and you can put it in different bottles so they're all full, it's good. Then you put a bubbler on each, or a balloon. Balloons are cheap. Everybody laughs. It's the old Pruno thing, right? Balloons are cheap, but you know what? They work. So if you're really looking for the low buck way to do it, it's free. It's probably free if you hit the right restaurant. I don't know what that is if you can find it, but it's probably like $1. The honey you got, right? I mean, raisins, that's probably your biggest expense right there. I mean, people that aren't making mead, if you're a beekeeper, you're really missing an opportunity.
Rush supply, $35 for 55 pounds.
Of what, raisins?
Raisins.
Oh boy, I can make a lot out of that.
You ever use up crystallized honey?
I have.
Yeah.
Crystallized honey is perfect because it, when you add the water to it, guess what? It goes back into solution.
Yeah.
Ferments just fine. I'll also
How do you get it out of the combs?
Oh well, I'm not going to go there. I've fought that battle too sometimes. But the thing is that the flavor, particularly and that's another point. For your primary ferment, if you're doing like I do for a lot of melomels, where you're doing like fruit flavored stuff, most of your fruit flavors are added after your primary. And the reason you do that is the primary is pretty vigorous. I mean, even if you're not using 1118, it strips everything out. I mean, if you can have this beautiful floral honey, your best honey, and you put it in your primary, and even with some of the milder yeasts, you're going to lose a lot of that flavor and a lot of that aroma just by that process. Okay, as it gets broken down into alcohol and carbon dioxide, a lot of your aromatics will come off, and you'll lose so much. So if you've got honey that is either crystallized or isn't really stuff you can sell or something like that, but still tastes okay, absolutely that's what you want to use in your primary, and then you can backfill, back taste with whatever your fruit flavor is, and you're good to go. So, but if you back sweeten it, okay, where you want a sweet mead, and again, I got a couple of sweet meads for you to try. If you do that, always use your best honey. That's the flavor that will come through. That's the flavor that'll stay. So that's the good stuff. Yes, sir.
Do you have to kill the yeast if you're going to back sweeten it?
No, because what I typically do is I ferment it right to what the yeast will take. The things that are toxic to yeast. The yeast will either run out of sugars, it'll hit its alcohol limit, or it'll hit its carbon dioxide limit. And the carbon dioxide one's the tough one, because that means it can come back, and a lot of them will do that. So what I try and do is I try and ferment them to their alcohol limit. And to do that, what I do is I do a bunch of tricks that are beyond the scope of this presentation. But I'll do things like I'll do particularly when I'm starting it off, I'll do an oxygen agitation. There's several additives that I'll do to knock, the pH too. You have to adjust the pH to get it to really go as far as you want it. Now I'll do all of that to try and get it absolutely to its alcohol limit. And that I found is the best shot at trying to keep it from blowing up bottles later. Camden Tablets are designed for that, but I've had very, very limited success with these guys. Again, I can tell you some stories. So good question. Yes, sir.
You ever done anything with a buckwheat honey as far as a mead goes?
I haven't. I have to say I haven't. But buckwheat's a strong honey.
Yeah.
So, well, again, you can use it for your primary. Primary, most of that, if you don't like the taste of buckwheat, it'll strip out. You really want to strip it out, use 1118. 1118 will leave you alcohol, water, and carbon dioxide, pretty much, no matter what you put in there.
I was thinking more if you liked it and wanted to leave it in.
Get rid of the water. Sorry.
Well, what if you liked it and kind of wanted a mead that sort of represented that flavor of honey?
Absolutely, that's good. And if there's any flavors, like I made a grapefruit mead because I like my honey on grapefruit. That's how I do a lot of things, right? So you know, you make. I'm just telling you, you know, that's the way it goes. You know, you get that honey taste, you get that grapefruit taste. You know, in your drink and stuff. Oh my gosh, it's so good. It's as good as it gets. Like I said, if you're not making mead. Oh, sorry. Question?
No.
Oh, okay. My lovely wife in the back. Question?
No, that was just Chuck over there.
Oh, okay. Yes, ma'am.
Can you use dehydrated fruits?
Sure.
Like dehydrated apple slices or dehydrated?
Yep. What I would do is I'd grind them up, and make sure you put them in a bucket. Okay, because you're going to have to put them in. What I'd do is I'd wait until the yeast really kind of gets going, and then I'd put it. You know, I'd let some of that initial kind of crazy, you know, agitation get by, and then maybe in the second week, let it go for a week. Second week in a bucket, then I'd add it, and basically let it ferment to the point where it stops, and then I'd siphon it off. But I'll tell you, the best way and the easiest way I've found is to use liquids. You know, if like there's one back there that you're going to get a chance to try. I got from Moonlight Meaderies up in, I think it's in Vermont, either Vermont or New Hampshire. Awesome. There was a podcast that the gentleman that started, I can't think of his name now, but and he actually was talking about, you know, he's like, you know, kind of like I am, except way beyond me. And, you know, he's talking about all the different things he did and so on. And he gave out the recipe. He actually, everything. He said, you know, you add this, that, this. You know, it's blueberry, it's elderberry, and black cherry. And you can go down to the store. I bought them at Stop and Shop. You can buy the concentrates. And I mixed it all up, my honey, and it's really good stuff. You know, it's a little sweet. You know, it's more of an after dinner thing, but it is very tasty. I have to tell you, that's my type of thing. I much prefer going with the juices because I can add them late. You know, I can add them in secondary after all the primary fermentation is done. All the flavors stay, and you can adjust it. You know, again using the siphon to get the flavors just where you want them, sweetness. You know, the flavors, and it'll stay like that. That's what I love. If you're gonna put chunk like the frozen strawberry example I used, or anything like that in primary, it's going to change on you. You know, some things will get better, some things won't, and you know you're more of a crapshoot. I found, you know, if you add after, it's pretty much pretty stable. So that's my preference anyway. Okay, other questions?
Let's drink.
Works for me. What I've got on the table back there that my wife is going to be managing for you is a number of different things. I brought the trying to get to the front of the line. So what I recommend is if you're really not sure, or if you get one that you don't like, don't hesitate to, like, you know, put it somewhere, throw it out or whatever, and go back and try another one. Because I purposely, you know, tried to pull in a lot of different flavors. You know, so you can kind of get a feel for. Unfortunately, they're all melomels. You can make meads with capsaicin if you like hot, peppery stuff. You can make it with malt if you like beer. You know, malt and hops. So it's almost like a fortified beer. I don't do any of that, so unfortunately I don't have any of that for you. But if you like fruit flavors and stuff, I got some stuff that I think you'll like. Okay? Okay.
Yeah.